Dina, thank you. I would like to start out by first thanking Senator Smith, not only for being here today, but for also sharing my story on the Senate floor a few years ago. I have never felt more represented by a politician than I do by you, and I want you to know that I'm so proud to be truly represented in Washington, D.C. My husband, who isn't with me today, and I both come from big families, and we want a good sized family ourselves. And in 2016, it was really shaping up to be a pretty good year for us. We bought our first home, and I earned tenure in my teaching position, and we got pregnant on the first try. We were so excited. Our families were so excited. Halfway through our pregnancy, it was August, we went in for our 20-week ultrasound. We were so thrilled to be finding out the gender of our baby. I had already bought decorations for a gender reveal party that we were planning that evening. But then everything changed. The genetic counselor from maternal fetal medicine came in, and she had a legal pad that was just filled with fatal flaws that our baby had. She began reading them to us, but I had to stop her before she reached the bottom. I couldn't even hear them all. The baby we had planned for and prepared for had stopped developing. We would never meet him and never hold him. We had already picked out names and started the nursery, and I had just recently felt him moving. The room spun, and I searched for anything to save me, but nothing did. I just remember thinking, this couldn't be my story. This couldn't be my baby. But it was. And then she told us that my placenta was enlarged and was growing into my uterus. And if we waited any more than 3 weeks, I would likely lose my uterus. It was not going to take my life, but just the life that I had wanted, the life my husband and I had planned. The next few days were a dark blur. We were referred by our doctors to Planned Parenthood for our abortion. The clinic treated us with compassion and helped us take care of all of the details of our son's cremation. They gave us his tiny hands and footprints that we cherish. They're the only piece of our son that we will ever get to hold. Abortion is referred to as a choice, but I did not choose it. It was the only choice I had. In the past, people trying to reassure me say that they don't consider what happened to me an abortion. And although good intentioned, that does not help anyone. I had an abortion. And the only reason I am able to have children today is because of that abortion. Every woman, every family, and every pregnancy is different. Abortion is essential healthcare, and everyone deserves the right to have the life they choose. When or if to have children is such an intimate and important decision, everybody deserves it. Today, I am truly blessed to be able to say my husband and I welcomed our rainbow baby into our family exactly 1 year after our abortion, and he just turned 4. And now we have another child, our very own pandemic baby, who is 18 months old. Our abortion procedure saved my uterus, and I was able to grow our 2 sons in it. My husband and I still want to add to our family, and that's one big reason why I'm here today. When I think about the Texas Senate Bill 8, I get so concerned for the families in Texas who have yet to start, for the families who have yet to be completed like mine. I knew I was pregnant by 6 weeks, but my baby didn't stop developing properly until 12 weeks, well after the ban allows. And I didn't find out I was pregnant, I didn't find out that my baby had fatal flaws until I was 20 weeks or 5 months pregnant, just like many other women who get devastating diagnoses. The Texan law would have left me without a uterus and without children. The bill opens up a wound for me and many other women who have similar stories to mine. I am in an online group with many other women and men from around the world who share my feelings of fear and anger. It's hard to stop from putting myself within the law. I've been trying to understand how much worse I would have felt, knowing that the calls I made to my family and friends for support could have opened them up to be sued and to face legal consequences. I keep hearing people say Uber drivers could be jailed for bringing them to a clinic. But for me and so many others, it's a husband, a partner, a sister, a mom, a grandma, not a random stranger who brings them to their abortion appointment. It's our loved ones who we don't want to get in trouble. I needed my family for support, and I needed my friends to help get me through. I cannot imagine this added stigma of being a criminal to the already heavy burden of needing an abortion. Thinking back about telling my employer and the families of my students about the circumstances surrounding my abortion, was I also putting them at risk of aiding and abetting? Or worse, giving them an opportunity to sue me and my family? Senate Bill 8 takes an already isolating situation and makes it worse. I need to prevent this bill and others like it. We need to keep abortion access open and safe for all of the people who need one, regardless of the situation that put them there. Thank you all for listening to my story. Thank you all for being here and helping to keep abortion safe and legal. I'm now turning the screen over, and I have the pleasure of introducing Sarah Stace, President of the Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota Action Fund.
I think we have an audio problem.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry we're having audio difficulty. One moment. And Sarah will, let's have Dr. Hardiman speak. Okay, Sarah?
I'm so sorry. I'm having all kinds of technical problems this morning. I really apologize. I was just saying, Tippy, how incredibly grateful I am to you for sharing your story. It is so difficult sometimes when we have these discussions about abortion and we debate what it means to make any tangible sense on a human level of what it is that we're talking about. And you have helped us to do that today. So I deeply, deeply appreciate you coming forward in this public way. Thank you very, very much. I am Sarah Stace. I am the president of the Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota Action Fund. I am very proud to be here today with this incredibly impressive group of people. Planned Parenthood is also very, very proud to provide comprehensive sexual and reproductive health care. Abortion is safe and legal in the United States, most of it, except Texas, and in Minnesota today, but it is true. We are in a brand new era, and access to that safe and legal abortion that so many of us take for granted all across this country is now in very, very grave doubt. We have watched this month in absolute horror as politicians in Texas enacted SB 8, which was an absolutely contemptible action that completely eliminated abortion in its safe and legal form at 6 weeks of pregnancy, which is before most people have any idea that they are pregnant. And moreover, these politicians enacted an unprecedented system of vigilante justice, empowering any person, anywhere, to sue anyone who helps anyone get an abortion, and then offers a reward of at least $10,000 if they are successful. This is by far and away the most extreme abortion ban since Roe v. Wade, and it comes with the very particular cruelty, and I really want to underscore this, of harming those who cannot very easily jump on a plane and go somewhere else to seek care. So people who already face significant systemic barriers to care, people of color, people who are low income, people who live in rural areas. And at the same time that Texas and other states are working to wipe out this safe and legal abortion access, we are also seeing efforts in states all across the country to eliminate access to contraception and sex education. This access is being decimated in states all over, and it is unacceptable. The decision of when or if to become a parent is deeply personal. We all must make this decision for ourselves, and oppressive laws such as this should never force anyone into pregnancy or into parenthood. And so we have a lot of work ahead of us, without a doubt. The United States Supreme Court has let SB 8 take effect for now, and it has also empowered other states to do the same. And we've seen governors such as Kristi Noem in South Dakota, right next door to us, pledging that she's going to introduce copycat legislation. And this fall, the United States Supreme Court is also going to hear a case from Mississippi that has the potential to likewise completely overturn Roe versus Wade. So our mission right now at Planned Parenthood is more important than it ever has been in our history. And Minnesota's role in our region and in our country is more important. Thankfully, we have leaders like Governor Walz and Representative Morrison protecting us here in Minnesota, and we have champions like Senator Tina Smith fighting at the federal level. So it is absolutely crucial that we fortify these strong leaders. We thank them, we fortify them, and we grow their numbers. So Minnesotans are asking what they can do at this critical moment. And the one thing I really want to underscore is speak up. Please speak up. Everywhere you go, we must destigmatize abortion, and we must help people understand what's at stake. So talk to your family, talk to your friends, your neighbors, speak up on social media. It is time that the Supreme Court also hear from people so that they understand what people in this country really feel and believe about abortion. Hold your elected leaders accountable. Elected leaders who reflect our values and stand up for these reproductive rights matter more than ever. And then finally join us on October 2nd. We are going to have a march for a National Day of Action. Please join us and participate with us. In spite of Texas, Roe is still the law of the land, and standing up for safe and legal abortion is a key reason Planned Parenthood has been here for so many years and will be here for so many years. We will never, ever, ever give up. So thank you very, very much. And now I would like to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Rachel Hardiman. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It is an honor to be here among these incredible panelists and fighters for women's rights. I'm Rachel Hardiman, and I am an associate professor at the University of Minnesota School of Public Health, and I'm a reproductive health equity researcher, meaning that my research seeks to expand our understanding of racism as a fundamental determinant of reproductive health and healthcare across the life course. I also serve as the founding director of the Center for Anti-Racism Research for Health Equity at the University of Minnesota, where we are challenging deeply embedded racism and racial health inequities through authentic community engagement, education, anti-racist and collaborative research, and by changing negative narratives about health for people of color. And I'm going to take a few minutes today to offer you a very brief overview of the historical context of the barriers faced by people of color and Black birthing people as it relates to reproductive health and access to healthcare within the context of the Texas Senate Bill 8. That means that we have to start over 400 years ago. And so I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about the 400 years of history of our country, but I do think it's important to understand that context for inequity as we think about who's going to be most impacted by this legislation in Texas. We have to be able to understand that this inequity is deeply embedded and ingrained in our society and in our country. And it started over 400 years ago in 1619 when the first group of Africans were sold into bondage in Jamestown, Virginia. And if we think about our nation's history, what we see is that Black enslavement makes up about 60% of our country's history, and Jim Crow laws, so those state and local laws that enforce racial segregation make up 20% of our country's history. So 80% of our country's history is steeped in racist ideas and actions that have and continue to impact communities of color and reproductive health across our country. And I think a lot of folks get sort of confused by that, about how, sort of our history is so deeply connected to what we're seeing right now in this moment. And so I'm going to offer a couple of examples along the way that have really dictated and set the tone for what we're seeing in Texas. So, first, we saw James Marion Sims, right, who was the father of modern gynecology, or known as the father of modern gynecology, who really took the liberties to operate on Black enslaved women during slavery. And that's where we see this control of Black bodies begin. It started with Sims and many of his colleagues, where they experimented and did research upon Black bodies throughout the history of slavery. And I think it's important to understand, as we think about control of of bodies, and Black bodies and bodies of color in particular, we have to understand what that meant historically, right? So from the perspective of slave owners, James Marion Sims' developments, his research and his innovation was notable because it meant that healed enslaved women could retain their economic value. Because a Black enslaved woman's womb was actually considered to be one of the most important and most valuable commodities, providing profit to slave owners. And then in the early 20th century, we see birth control offer this newfound freedom over women's bodies. But we see the reproductive rights movement then become co-opted by eugenicists, who through forced sterilization determined who was unfit for motherhood. And often that was women who were poor, low income, women of color, women with disabilities. At one point, 32 states had adopted mandatory sterilization laws in the 1930s and 1940s. And by the 1970s, 70,000 people women had been forcibly sterilized across the United States, including a third of women of childbearing age in Puerto Rico, and nearly a quarter of indigenous women in the United States, which actually caused some smaller tribes to face near extinction. Also, in our history and contemporary sort of issues within the United States, we are the only country that is facing a rising maternal mortality rate. And we can't ignore the inextricable link between maternal mortality and morbidity, and access to abortion and access to sexual and reproductive health care and education in the United States. So what we see is that the risk for maternal mortality is unevenly distributed in the US, with some populations bearing substantially greater risk. Among the groups at highest risk for maternal mortality, so death in during the prenatal period or in the first year postpartum, are Black women, are Black birthing people, and Indigenous birthing people. In fact, Black birthing people in the United States are actually 4 times more likely to die of a pregnancy-related cause in comparison to their white counterparts. And that's regardless of education and socioeconomic standing. So at the root of these issues and the root of this historical context that I briefly offered is the fact that structural racism is a fundamental cause of reproductive health inequities in the United States. And when I refer to structural racism, what I'm talking about is really the many ways, sort of that totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing systems of housing, education, employment, earnings, benefits, policing, healthcare delivery, and criminal justice, and many, many more. And what happens is these patterns and practices of inequity and discrimination then reinforce discriminatory beliefs and values. And also it dictates the distribution of resources. It's embedded in the policies, as we've seen with the Texas Senate Bill 8. And it's historically and contemporarily made it very difficult for Black birthing people and BIPOC birthing people to access the continuum of reproductive healthcare services. So Texas Senate Bill 8 certainly has dire consequences for many people, as we just heard from Sarah. I believe it has even more dire consequences for people from Black, Indigenous, and Indigenous communities and other communities of color, for undocumented immigrant communities, for low-income communities, disabled communities, as well as folks in rural America. The bill bans abortion, as you heard, before most people even know they're pregnant, meaning that most people won't have the luxury of knowing that they're pregnant that early and being able to jump through those hoops. They will be unable to jump through those hoops and be forced then to carry out a pregnancy that may not be wanted. You know, effectively forcing women and birthing people to be pregnant is going to exacerbate the inequities we are already facing in our country with respect to maternal mortality and morbidity and much more. We can certainly expect to see emergency room visits increase and all of the other ways that structural racism shows up in our systems and in our society. So whether it's child protection involvement, violence, domestic violence, or violence against intimate partners, abandonment and job loss due to the law are also incredibly important. Additionally, I wanted to bring up the point that Sarah made around the bill encouraging private citizens to file civil suits against those seeking abortions or even aiding someone who's looking to terminate a pregnancy. I think it's important to think about how this creates a surveillance state, right? So we know that being over surveilled is something that BIPOC communities, Black communities face daily. Some of my own research has shown that here in the Twin Cities, we see that in communities that are over policed, in communities where women are more likely to experience police contact, we see higher rates of preterm birth in those communities. We also are doing a lot of work right now to look at how police violence and police brutality in communities impacts reproductive health outcomes. So as we think about this new level of surveillance that this bill adds to women's bodies and to women's livelihood and their day-to-day lives, the chilling effect on what should be a deeply private decision-making process is incredibly concerning. So I think I'll just close my comments by reminding us that we know that people with resources, right, will still be able to receive the care that they need. High income or affluent folks in Texas will be able to figure out a way to travel across state lines to get an abortion. This bill has a horrifying impact on communities that don't have resources, that don't have access. And it's going to, we're going to see our maternal mortality and our maternal morbidity rates rise as folks seek alternate options to end a pregnancy due to Texas Senate Bill 8. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm U.S. Senator Tina Smith, and I'm just so grateful to be able to be a part of this amazing panel. And I want to thank Sarah Stace and Planned Parenthood and Planned Parenthood Action Fund for organizing this. Dr. Hardiman, thank you so much for your work and for the comments that you make to help us understand that the legacy of racism in our country is not our history, it is our present. And it continues to have devastating impacts on the opportunities of Black and Brown and Indigenous people, all people of color, to have access to healthcare and housing and jobs and economic opportunity. And that issue is directly relevant to what we are here talking about today. Tippy, I want to thank you so much for what you did at the beginning of this conversation, which is to remind us that this is about the individual lives and circumstances of people and families. This is not a political issue for most folks. This is a personal issue. And as I was listening to you tell your story, I was thinking about being here with all of you, not only as a United States Senator, but also as a mom and a grandmother, and as a former volunteer and executive at Planned Parenthood myself, where I heard over and over again the personal stories of people who came to Planned Parenthood looking for ways to have the freedom and the opportunity to build the lives that they choose, not the lives that somebody else chose for them, but the lives that they choose. And as you said, Tippy, sometimes those choices are painful, but the question is who should be making them? And that is really what is at the root of what brings us here together today. Today, the reproductive rights of people are at the greatest peril that they have been since Roe versus Wade was decided. With this Texas decision, the Supreme Court appears ready to throw out 50 years of constitutional precedent and to allow this blatant attack on women's freedom to stand. And as Dr. Hardiman and Sarah pointed out, the impacts of this decision in Texas are deeply discriminatory, because those that will end up paying the terrible price are those that don't have the opportunity to fly to another state, to take the extraordinary means that are now required for them to exercise their constitutional choices. And we need to be very clear, I believe, about how we got here. It's not an accident of our history that this is where we find ourselves. The Texas decision is a travesty, but it is not a surprise. What we see today is the culmination of 50 years of effort to radically remake the courts in our country with the help of large amounts of dark money and organizations like the Federalist Society. And now, tragically, the Texas decision and the Texas law is, as Sarah said, a blueprint for other states to go after not only reproductive rights, but potentially a whole slew of other rights that are guaranteed by the Constitution through this bizarre mechanism that they have created, essentially putting our friends and neighbors in the place of providing the vigilante justice that we see here in the Texas case. So what do we do about this? Well, there is no magic lever. There is no wand that I can wave in the United States Senate to reverse what has been this steady erosion of women's reproductive rights and the steady politicization of our courts. We can send tweets and press releases and feel great about that, but that is not going to make the difference that we need. I wanted everyone on this call to know that I strongly support passing the Women's Health Protection Act, which would codify Roe versus Wade in law. But this is not something that 60 United States senators agree with, though it is something that I believe a majority of Americans agree with. This is one of the reasons why I support ending the filibuster, because I believe that the Senate should function as a democratic organization. And this old rule that has been used to thwart the will of the majority for too long really needs to go. But in the meantime, what we can do, and I want to close with this, is something that Sarah said that is so important. What we can do in this moment is to organize, 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 because the Supreme Court decision is dramatically out of step with what Americans want. We need representatives in the state legislature, as Representative Morrison will talk about in a minute, representatives in the US House and in the US Senate that are going to not only stand up for women's reproductive rights, but are going to have the numbers to vote for all people's rights. That is what I am going to be working on right now. And I believe that this will be a galvanizing issue for Americans and for Minnesotans as we look at the politics of the next several months. We can see this already unfolding in states across this country. So I'm grateful to all of you. I'm glad to be with you all. I look forward to the questions that we have. And I believe now I will turn it over to Representative Kelly Morrison.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Boy, what an honor to share this space with these champions of reproductive health and freedom. I am so grateful for the work that Dr. Hardiman, Sarah Stace, and Senator Smith all do. And thank you, Tippy, so much for sharing your story. I'm Kelly Morrison. I'm the state representative for District 33B in the Minnesota House. And I'm also a practicing obstetrician gynecologist, and I've had the privilege of taking care of Minnesotans for 20 years. And if I've learned anything over these years, and of course, in my own lived experience, it's that people do best when they have autonomy over their own bodies. The ability to decide whether and when to become a parent is foundational to our freedom and economic well-being. These are deeply personal decisions that should not be made that should be made between a person and their provider, not by anti-abortion politicians or judges. Minnesota's been a beacon of access for reproductive health care in the upper Midwest as states around us have chipped away at abortion rights and rendered abortion essentially inaccessible. As the Supreme Court prepares to hear a case this fall that could formally overturn Roe versus Wade, we must prepare for that possibility here in Minnesota. If the court overturns Roe, large sections of the Midwest and the South would be left without abortion care. Now, we're fortunate here in Minnesota because our Supreme Court guaranteed the right to privacy, including the right to have an abortion, in the 1995 Doe versus Gomez decision. So if Roe versus Wade were overturned, abortion would still be legal in Minnesota. But given the assault on reproductive rights and freedoms that we're seeing this past year, a record number of bills restricting access to or outright banning abortion were introduced and many passed into law at the state level nationally. So we need a double layer of protection in state law here in Minnesota, which is why I introduced the Protect Reproductive Options Act, or PRO Act. The PRO Act would establish the fundamental right of Minnesotans to make autonomous individual decisions about their own reproductive health care, including contraception, abortion, and pregnancy. The PRO Act would protect Minnesotans' reproductive freedom to decide when or if to become a parent, and it would prevent politicians from interfering with a person's fundamental right to make their own reproductive health care decisions. And it's worth noting that while abortion is legal in Minnesota, there actually are many restrictions in Minnesota law that can limit access here too. And we can't forget that there are aggressively anti-abortion politicians working hard to impose their ideological will on other people here. Bills banning abortion are introduced every year in the Minnesota legislature. I have stood up on the floor of the House several times to speak against attempts to amend those bans onto other bills. Make no mistake, there are ideologically driven politicians who would impose their personal ideology on all Minnesotans and ban abortion care here if given the chance. And this, as we've discussed, would disproportionately impact communities of color, low-income and rural Minnesotans, and Minnesotans living with disabilities. These bans are cruel, they are undemocratic, and they are antithetical to the stated American ideals of liberty, freedom, and opportunity. So there's work to do. This is a watershed moment in the history of our country for multiple reasons, and the potential loss of the right to bodily autonomy is absolutely one of them. The ripple effect of that would, of course, impact all Americans. We cannot let this dystopian vision become reality. We have to stand up for every person's reproductive freedom and demand that our laws protect those rights. And I believe I'll turn it back to Dina now.
Indeed, what a profound and insightful discussion we've had. Now it's time for you, our audience on Facebook Live and the media, to pose your questions before the panel. As remember, you can post your questions in the Zoom chat, or those of Facebook can place them in the comment section. Well, we already have our first question, and it is for you, Representative Morris, I believe. It is very difficult to hear Ms. Amundsen's story, and I'm sure that it touches the hearts of many. But the backers of Texas Senate Bill 8 point out that the fetus in many cases has a heartbeat at 6 weeks and contend that it therefore is a living human being. How do you counter that in this very polarized political environment? Is there anything, for lack of a better word, a middle ground?
Thank you, Dina, and thanks for the question. You know, I think it's important to point out that this actually isn't that polarized or polarizing an issue. Polling repeatedly shows that the majority of Minnesotans and the majority of Americans support the right of people to make their own reproductive health care decisions. And so I think that this is an example of where some of our elected officials and our elected bodies do not reflect the will of the people.
Does anyone else, I see a lot of head, but anyone else would talk about, is there such thing as a middle ground? Okay.
Here, Kelly.
Do we have any more questions from the Facebook audience or from the media? Please put them in the comment section or the chat section. Okay, I think we could give it a couple of seconds, but we're going to submit it before closing. And
I can just kind of add to or respond to that question a little bit. I think it's hard to think of like a middle ground when there was nobody else but me and my husband and the doctors in our at our appointment, and yet there were so many people there that I didn't want there, that shouldn't have been there. And there were legislators there, there were people who had their sentiments about abortion, and it's hard to think of setting a middle ground in somebody's body. And so I just encourage others to try not to put themselves in those rooms with women and family and women and families that they don't really want to be there. It was the worst place I've ever been in my life. And to think about people wanting to come into that room is just not a very pleasant thought. So just add my thoughts to that.
well, we did have an additional question come through, and this is, I believe, for Senator Smith, which is, what would you say to conservative legislators who are looking to pass this harmful legislation?
Dina, I couldn't quite hear which looking to pass this legislation like this.
Yes, I shall repeat the question. What would you say to conservative legislators who are looking to pass this harmful legislation?
Well, what I would say is that I believe that decisions about healthcare should be made by the people that are getting the healthcare and the providers that are providing the healthcare. And I think that Tippy just put it so beautifully. The decision makers in the room should be the family members, the people that are getting the healthcare and their providers. And right now, we have looking over the shoulders of those providers and those patients, those women, a whole slew of legislators and others trying to second guess and trying to decide what should be done. And I just think that that's wrong. And I would ask those conservative legislators, I would say, certainly I respect your views, but I would ask them whether they want somebody looking over their shoulders as they are making decisions for themselves about their own families. And I think that it is sort of a fundamental human understanding that this should be a matter of it's a personal decision that you're making. So that's what I would say.
Wonderful.
I'd like to just add to that for a second, if I may, Dina, and that is just to remind everybody, we aren't talking about SB 8 eliminating all abortion. SB 8 is simply eliminating safe and legal abortion. And that is the point to keep in mind. It underscores the point that Dr. Hardiman made, that all the speakers have made. People with means are going to be able to get abortion. That is true before Roe. It will be true if Roe is overturned. We are talking about a particularly cruel and inequitable public policy that will be imposed on people who have no other choices, not on people who have choices. That would be people with means. That would be primarily people of privilege and a lot of white people. And what we must keep in mind is the equity issue that underlies this whole discussion that we're having about abortion. It's not all abortion that becomes inaccessible. It is safe and legal abortion that becomes inaccessible.
Indeed. I'm going to ask, our next question is this. How can citizens support birthing people and leaders during this time? And what actions can we take right now towards necessary protection? Sarah?
I'm sorry. Dina, I'm sorry, I just couldn't quite hear you. Would you mind repeating that? What
Yes.
actions can we take right now?
How can citizens support birthing people
Action.
and leaders during this time, and what actions can we take now towards necessary protections?
Okay, so first of all, it is really important to destigmatize abortion. So let us just talk about that. It is very important for people to speak out and to talk to one another. I know you might not want to talk about this over the dinner table or with your friends at the neighborhood picnic, but it is important to talk about it because everybody knows about it anyway, and people are thinking about it. So please, please talk about it. It is, I can't possibly stress enough how important it is to make sure people understand that what abortion is and how normal it is in the lives of many, many people in this country. Secondly, hold elected leaders accountable and uplift and reinforce those powerful leaders who are champions, such as Representative Morris, such as United States Senator Tina Smith, and so many others who are doing the hard work every single solitary day, standing up in bodies that are not necessarily the most friendly, and speaking out over and over and over again. Make sure that they know that they are supported and that we have their backs just as they have our backs. And of course, vote, please vote.
Well, what a wonderful way to close, and thank everyone. And I want to thank you, our panel, our viewers, and everyone for watching Grower at Risk, how we can protect and expand abortion access in Minnesota. As we discuss recent attacks on abortion across the country and what we can do in Minnesota and in DC to fight for our reproductive freedom. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.